today we are having a little bit of a different video from our normal dioramas, as today I wanted to paint up this heretic bashing Inquisitor. Now, very little is known about the Inquisitor Ostromandeus, like literally a paragraph. But hear me, that won't stop me from talking about his in-depth lore. So, Ostro for short hails from the Ordo Hereticus, tasked with expunging cultists and insurgents within the Imperium, and that's all we know. But the idea of a detective infiltrating these space cults in a Cthulian way really checks all the boxes in my brain for what might be one of my favourite bits of Warhammer. But I rambled on for too long, so to recap, to blend the plastic into the base, I'm using Humbrol's Smart Mud for diorama texturing, and this really is one of the most useful hobbying items I own. Now, there was a small gap between the fur, so I used some Tamiya's basic putty to fit it in, but I later on replaced it with some Milliput because it did look a bit better. Now, to get this base looking like a woodland, I placed a skull and sprinkled some sand on top of the clay for some added texture, while also grabbing some tiny foam leaves for that sweet, sweet look. So to get all this glued on, I grabbed some isopropyl alcohol, and using a pipette, I dropped it onto the sand and foam to get rid of any surface tension for when we now pour our thinned down PVA or white glue onto the ground. So with the model now built, let's grab our priming cans and start with a spray of black. Then we can spray some white or grey from above to see some of that great detail on the model. Now it's about 5 PM here in the UK, so all of our precious sunlight has escaped for the rest of the year. But once we're back into the studio lights, we can see how much nice detail there is. Now we can start painting the Inquisitor, and because I hate painting light colours over a large surface, I painted his cape in a sandy colour, but trust me, you won't need an airbrush for anything else in this video. Even this you can paint on really easily. I then airbrushed with some pale sand from above, all over the cloak for some quick contrast. But let's head back and start painting with a normal brush. So here I've highlighted some of the areas I'm going to be painting in a lighter colour scheme, generally where the light reflections are going to be on the cape. And for this I use just pure pale sand on my brush. And as you can see, I'm just using the slight edge of my brush to strike down. And if I mess up, just quick wipe with my finger. Now, because we already have a lot of light surfaces, I'm switching over to some Black Legion contrast paint, as it's going to look great over all the armour. Just be as careful as you can not to get any on his capes. Now, after facing the horror of forgetting to put my lid fully down on my Rhinox hide, I managed to retrieve but one brushful, and after thinning it down, I managed to paint all of the leather with it. So, all in all, it's alright for now. I just need to find a good equivalent dropper bottle version of Rhinox hide. So swiftly moving on, it's time to paint all of the major metallics for the model, and for this I chose Thrash Metal by Scale 75. As it's a really nice warm silver, I also used Black Metal for his arms, to just differentiate the different types of metals that you might find. So either one will work perfectly. Okay, so it's finally time for some fine details, and for this I'm using matte red, so let's power up to 100%. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's paint the rest of the red insignia on the Inquisitor. The basic theme of this is that it's okay to spill the paint anywhere, but you really want to try not spill any on the sandy cloaks, as it will be really hard to fix. One of the biggest inspirations for painting this mini was the Harkonens from Dune, as I think they are probably somewhat related to the Inquisition and Warhammer, doing all of the Emperor's shady busywork. And they are so cool, their colour schemes are amazing, and I chose to use their skin tone for this mini, that pale white. So for his skin tones, there's not much more to it other than just this quick base coat of a very white grey. I also quickly dry brushed his back furs with the paint, just in case I want to use some contrast paints later on. Now this is where the fun begins, as it's my first time painting a power sword ever, and I didn't really want to look up what other people have painted it as, just to see what unique thing I can come up with. So to start, I painted it with black metal as a base coat, and then painted the rest of his armour in elven gold. So taking a quick break away from the sword, I painted his fur in a mixture of dark oath flesh and wildwood contrast paints to get a really nice dark brown in the recesses and a slightly lighter brown near the tops of the fur. I ended up not quite liking the golden hand, so I painted some black over it before painting some skeleton horde contrast paint over all of the skulls on the model. Okay, so let's quickly get back to the sword, and for this you can use a white paint, or in this case I grabbed a white gel pen and drew lightning patterns which look more like slashes all the way down the sword. Then after letting it dry for a while, I grabbed this beautifully blue contrast paint and thinned it down 1:1 and then coated the whole sword on it. Then once that was dry, I added some more white edge highlighting down the sword, but this time I painted it more like a fire or a sound wave going down this blade. And if I ever made a quick little mistake, I just tapped it with my finger, as you know what, it's a bit more texture. And then finally I added one more coat of blue to complete the look of some energy pooling inside of his blade, which we can also add a tiny bit of details later on as well. And just for the sake of it, I added a grey wash onto his head, but honestly I really don't think it did anything. But finally I added a tiny green dot for his eye lens, and now it's time to move on. So before doing any enamel work, so many people tell me to varnish my miniatures beforehand, and speaking from the future, I didn't really recognise any difference, other than maybe 5% less paint chipping, but for transparency's sake, I did do this quick varnish. Usually I wouldn't though. So moving on to my enamel stage, I coated this whole mini in dark streaking grime by AK Interactive, which as it says is a much darker green than the OG streaking grime. I'm not sure which one I prefer, but after leaving it for a minute or two after coating the whole miniature, I didn't let it fully dry and I moved quickly onto soaking some cotton wool buds in white spirits. This is so I can remove the wash we just poured all over this bad boy, with the aim of slightly staining the model and leaving it in the recesses. Now the most important part you'll have to keep an eye on is his cloak. And it's really up to you how much enamel wash you want on it or how stained you want it to be, but I still want it to look not too dirty, but quite dirty. Then a day later, once it was dry, I added another wash, but only at the bottom of things where his cloak would drag along or his boots would get dirty. And the wash I used was dark mud, just so it looks like it says dirty. I also mistakenly actually put a bit on the sword and then quickly wiped it off. However, I do think this was a great effect on the sword, and it really made that kind of dirty energy sword come to life. And here you have it, our base coated Inquisitor. Now next stages are we going to be adding some highlights as well as painting all of that base. As you see, I'm quite happy with how it turned out, especially for just a base coat. Now let's move on. So to start highlighting this model, I started with the leather, adding small edge highlights and scratches to make this nice worn out effect. And for all of the metallics on the model, I used the same base coat paint as before, but I repainted a lot of the flat panels, making sure to leave the washes in the recess, so that I can now give it shine back on the main parts of the model. And when I painted this gold, I got a tiny bit on the leather pouches, but a great tip is just flood it with water and hopefully you can catch it and get most of the paint off, so you don't have to repaint everything. Just make sure you have got all the paint off your brush, otherwise you'll be flooding that gold everywhere, which will be really bad because of the gold flakes. But next we are moving on to a slight grey edge highlight over all of the black armour panels, and I added small sketches on the flat panels to look like scratches. And for the fur, I added the same leather highlights as before, but this time to all the ends of the locks of fur, slowly adding pale sand into the mixture so it gets brighter towards the end. Okay, so I'm actually pretty happy with this mini for now, as it is fully battle ready. So it's finally time to paint the base, which I will be using Mantis Warriors Green, which is an amazing vivid green that will act as today's grass. And while it's wet, I added a tiny bit of Dark Oath Flesh into the mix, as it has a really nice yellowy brown pigment, which will blend in with that green and look lovely and a little bit muddy. And while it's still thankfully wet, I grabbed the previous Black Legion contrast paint and carefully dotted it around the ground for some more contrast. Then with a mixture of that black contrast paint and Dark Oath Flesh, I then painted the skull. And after painting the chunk of metal on the floor, I grabbed some auric flesh and dotted it all around the foam leaves we dropped on here earlier, and it'll add some nice brightness and variation to the ground. And then the final step, I grabbed some Agrax Earthshade, and like it says, shaded the earth.